1862, Republicans held a vast majority in Congress. Lincoln had, of course, won in 1860, and with him, he had brought many Republicans into Congress as well. Added to this was the fact that the southern states had seceded and were no longer in Congress, so the Republicans held a vast majority. There were Democrats as well, Northern Democrats, but all of those Southern congressmen who had been a roadblock for a generation in Congress were now gone. So what ends up happening is that the United States, the Union, can pass all sorts of congressional acts that the South had blocked before the Civil War. One thing which the Union does, and we'll talk about this at a later date, is that they passed an income tax, the first income tax in American history. It was a graduated income tax which fell more upon the wealthy than upon the poor. But they were now going to pass other acts which were intended to limit slavery and intended to undo much of the damage done by Southerners who had been protecting slavery in Congress for a generation. Now, amongst the Republicans, you had three groups. You had the Radicals, and the Radicals were the ones who were pressing Lincoln to use the wartime atmosphere to go ahead and emancipate slavery. They thought that now that war had broken out between North and South, wartime conditions justified the expropriation of enemy quote-unquote property. And as we saw in the last lecture, this was the reasoning which allowed enslaved people to be taken by the Union Army and put to work as so-called contraband. Now, there were also moderates in the Republican Party, and many of them, like Lincoln, were opposed to slavery, but they feared the consequences, racial and otherwise, of emancipation. Some of them even continued to support colonization efforts, and this was the answer which Whigs, who had been opposed to slavery in the early to mid 1800s, had always proposed as the answer to slavery. Of course, many whites in America feared that emancipating slavery would result in a race war and that enslaved people would never be satisfied and would always resent the whites who had enslaved them. So what was the answer? Send them away. Colonization efforts. And there were attempts made by the United States to colonize Africans in other places. Liberia is, of course, the most famous example of that, and many of the black people living in Liberia today are, in fact, descendants of African Americans who were sent there during the 1800s as a colonization effort to remove African people from slavery, but also from the country because of this fear amongst many whites that African Americans and whites would never be able to live together. And this idea still had some purchase amongst moderate Republicans like Lincoln. And in fact, during the Civil War, there was one attempt to try and colonize over 400 black people on an island near Haiti. It was disaster. It was a disaster. Nearly 100 of them died from disease, and eventually Union ships would have to evacuate them. Abolitionism, however, the idea of ending slavery and freeing the enslaved people, was gaining adherence, especially as the wartime goals of the Union quickly evolved, helped along in no small part by runaway African Americans who presented themselves at the Union lines, and which Union officers absolutely refused to return to their former owners. Wendell Phillips, for instance, a radical Republican, prior to the war, he had many death threats against him because he spoke openly and loudly against against slavery. Prior to the war, Wendell Phillips, his life was always threatened by people who were supporting of slavery. But during the Civil War, at last, he gained the freedom to speak, and now he could speak about the emancipation of slavery to packed houses in Washington, D.C., no longer fearful for his life. Republicans, especially radical and even moderate Republicans, were simply beginning to believe that the fate of the nation could not be separated from the fate of slavery. And beginning in 1862, bills dealing with slavery began to pour into Congress. And without Southerners there to stop them from accomplishing what they hoped to, Republicans were able to pass a number of very noteworthy bills that would have been impossible prior to the Civil War when Southerners were still in Congress to block their passage. For instance, finally, in 1862, Congress passed a ban on slavery in the territories. And as we've already seen, this was really what caused the Civil War, that Southerners were so resolute about being able to spread slavery into the territories. Well, finally, without Southerners there to block them in 1862, the Union was able to finally pass a ban on slavery in the territories, once and for all, undoing the Dred Scott decision, popular sovereignty, and all of these makeshift measures which had been compromises between North and South, between freedom and slavery. With no Southerners around, there would be no slavery in the territories. The Congress also managed to abolish slavery in Washington, D.C., and they even passed a new Homestead Act. Before the Civil War, all of these government lands in the territory had sat there vacant. Well, of course, Native Americans lived there, right? But that wasn't really much of a concern to people who were trying to get land into the hands of Americans who wanted to move out west. But the Southerners were always an impasse on homestead bills, which wanted to give land to settlers, white but also black, who would move west and set up on homesteads for themselves because Republicans wanted to make sure that slavery would not be allowed in these territories. Well, without Southerners around, they can now pass both a ban on slavery in the territories as well as a Homestead Act, which opens up all this territory to settlement by free people. Slavery will not be allowed. Another law forbade Union officers from returning quote-unquote contraband to the enemies. These would have been absolutely radical accomplishments before the Civil War, but now they barely scratched the surface. Radical Republicans were calling for an Emancipation Proclamation, a constitutional amendment which would end slavery once and for all. And it became clear that it was going to be very hard, unless the war ended very soon, for the Union to keep their war goal as simply the preservation of the Union. It became clear that this war was revolving from a war which was intended to just preserve the Union into a war that was also against slavery, especially as enslaved people just literally poured into Union camps. Now, how are black folks treated by the Union troops? Well, you got to remember that most of the troops in the North who signed up to fight the war because they wanted to preserve the Union, not because they wanted to end slavery. They had the same racism that, you could be found in many parts of the North, especially the Midwest. And in fact, Jim Crow laws, which, called for separate accommodations for whites and blacks, these laws actually began in the North before the Civil War. So what am I trying to say here? There was plenty of racism in the North, all right? And when black folks started to show up in camp, sometimes they were abused by Union troops. There was one particularly heinous crime. The New York 47th Infantry, a number of contraband or black folks came into the camp, and the New York 47th Infantry started chasing the black women, intending to rape them. Ultimately, the women escaped, but they did capture a young child who. But in any case, there were cases of Union soldiers abusing African Americans who made their way into the camps. But what's happening is that the abolitionist position, despite these sort of abuses of black people by certain Union soldiers, not all of them, but there were a few cases of abuse of African Americans who made it into the Union Army. What's happening is that the abolitionist position, the idea that this is a war which is being fought not just to preserve the Union, but perhaps to end slavery as well, is gaining traction. Now, if you remember, a good number of the states that stayed loyal to the Union did still have slavery. These were the border states: Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland, Missouri. They had slavery. And Lincoln, seeing that the war was taking a turn away from simply preserving the Union and towards abolishing slavery, tried to get the border states to abolish slavery peacefully. Right? He hoped that they would abolish slavery of their own volition. And in fact, he offered them very good terms for abolishing slavery. If the border states, which were still loyal to the Union, if they abolished their slaves, Lincoln promised that masters would be compensated for the value of the slaves that they freed. Right? It was going to be a gradual emancipation where it would not be overnight, but slowly certain populations of slaves would be freed one at a time. And yet the border states continued to refuse, right? They had divided loyalties anyways. We already mentioned how so many Missourians simply crossed over to the Confederacy to fight for slavery. When Lincoln tried to get border states like Missouri to go ahead and abolish slavery, he fought an uphill battle because slavery was something which they held, and they hoped to continue holding enslaved people. But what's happening is that the forces of history are just changing this position so quickly. David Hunter, in charge of occupying the Sea Islands, called for a sweeping emancipation of slavery in that area. Like Fremont before him, Lincoln rescinded the order, but it was a sign of the times that the Union Army was becoming ever so slowly but surely an army of the liberation of slavery. And after 1862, by the summer of 1862, after the 7 days battles, where the Union was unable to really effectively dislodge the Southern defense of Richmond, McClellan, the Union general in charge of the Army of the Potomac, had promised that he would capture Richmond. He failed to do so and suffered terrible casualties as the Confederacy pushed the Union away from Richmond, and within a month had them within 20 miles of Washington, D.C. As a result of the 7 days battles, it became very apparent that the war was going to be much harder and much longer than anybody had anticipated at the beginning. So this idea of a limited war for limited means, a war being fought just to preserve the Union, was becoming increasingly antiquated. And as the war expanded, as more people died, as the battles became bloodier, and the lists of casualties increased exponentially on both sides, not only did the war expand, but so too did the war goals expand. And it was in this atmosphere that the Union passed the Second Confiscation Act. Fugitive blacks who ran away from the plantations and towards the Union line were now considered captives of war and would henceforth be, according to the Second Confiscation Act, quote, forever free, unquote. So this Second Confiscation Act made no ambiguities about what the condition of African Americans who ran away from slavery would be in the Union camps. They would be free. But it did something else as well. In a very limited capacity, in July 1862, the Second Confiscation Act allowed the Union to begin enlisting runaway slaves to work for the Union Army, usually as laborers, but on occasion as soldiers. The first black battalions to fight in the Civil War were already out in the field in Louisiana and South Carolina by the end of 1862. Imagine how much this war has changed. From a war simply fought to preserve the Union, by late 1862, you have African Americans who are fighting against their former masters to destroy slavery.